Good morning. Let me join Martin Indyk in thanking all of you for being here. Terrific to see many old friends and several new ones. And let me also join him in our thanks to the government of Qatar for working with us on this panel on these important themes of U.S. relations with the Islamic world. My name is Bruce Jones. I'm the Vice President and the Director for Foreign Policy here at Brookings. The focus of this first panel is going to be on stabilization and reconstruction in the Middle East and North Africa. In other words, on the immediate and near-term challenges of dealing with a series of countries racked by war. We are all acutely aware of the civil wars and other forms of unrest that have gripped the region. These are wars that entangle and involve local actors who suffer the heaviest burden, national actors, but have also entangled the regional powers and increasingly also the global powers. And I think part of the discussion has to be what role the global and the regional powers play and can play in moving us from a situation of war to a situation of peace and reconstruction. These wars are so serious that when we look at the situation globally, we discover that 90% of all the people who have been killed in war in the past 5 years have been killed in wars in the Middle East and North Africa. It's such an intense aspect of the current situation of war in the world. But all wars end, and even while wars are raging, there are pockets of stability or relative stability and opportunities to move the situation in terms of a peace process or in terms of stabilization and reconstruction. And I think we want to begin a conversation both here and more broadly about how we can take those opportunities. But I think it's also important to underline these are not crises that came out of the past 5 years. They erupted into their acute phase in the past 5 years, but these are crises decades in the making, and they will not be resolved quickly. And if they are to be resolved, it seems to me at least, that we're going to have to work not just about economic reconstruction, not just about security stabilization, but about a political transformation, and to look at the kinds of inclusive politics and inclusive governance across the region that could allow us not only to recover from current wars and current tensions, but prevent a relapse and prevent the recurrence of this kind of violence. To help us think through these issues, we have an outstanding panel to kick us off today. Dr. Abdullah Al-Dadari is a senior advisor on reconstruction in the Office of the Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank. He previously served as both chief economist and director of the Economic Development and Globalization Division, as well as executive director of UN Economic Social Commission for Western Asia, and was previously deputy prime minister in Syria. Ambassador Annika Söder is the Swedish State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Among other positions, she's focused on stabilization and development issues as Ambassador at Large for Multilateral Cooperation, State Secretary for International Development Cooperation, and Assistant Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. She also has a special role today because Sweden is currently serving on the Security Council, and I may ask you about that. Mr. Adama Dieng is Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide. Prior to assuming this position in 2012, he served as the Registrar for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He's also held the post of Envoy of the Secretary General to Malawi and played a critical role in that position in the establishment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the draft of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Genocide. And finally, Ms. Samar Hadar is formerly the Vice Chair of the Board of the Arab Human Rights Fund, where she also served as the Executive Director, and previously was a Children's Rights Regional Program Coordinator at the Arab Resource Collective, as well as working with Dar al-Amal. So we have a range of perspectives to bring to the table in asking this question, not only about what are the current opportunities or where they might come for stabilization and reconstruction, but how we might use those opportunities to seed a different kind of politics and a different kind of development in the region to take us forward. Abdullah, I want to start with you and ask you if you could to situate the issue from your current vantage point in the World Bank. You and your team have been doing extensive work to look at the scale of the economic reconstruction in the region. And maybe you could just say a few words about how you see this issue and the scale of the challenge that's confronting us.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. We can contextualize the challenge in numbers. We are talking about economic losses that exceed $1 trillion, at least in the region, in the losses to capital, stock, and assets, to the losses in the GDP. Accumulated losses of GDP alone is almost $600 billion in the region since 2011. Human losses exceed 500,000 deaths, and bigger number in wounded I can give you, for example, in Syria alone, there are at least 450,000 people that will need artificial limbs at this moment. So we don't know in the near future where things will stop. So it's a tremendous economic challenge that is facing the region. Unemployment and poverty levels have increased dramatically. They are almost at the 80% level of the population in the conflict countries in the region. So bringing back jobs for the young people to avoid the relapse of conflict is extremely important. But dealing with these challenges is not an issue of economics alone. In fact, neoclassical economic theories don't explain what happened in the region. It's way beyond economics. In those countries, the question of inclusiveness, the question of participation, the question of institutions and who captured the economies pre-conflict, what were the dynamics of those societies at the moment of explosion, and where things moved during the past 6 years, the rise of the so-called war economy and the warlords of the war economy. Do these new interest groups have an interest in peace? And how do we then move from the confrontational equilibrium we have today, to which there are so many attached vested interests, to what we call a cooperative equilibrium towards peace? How do we make the peace economy more rewarding than a war economy in the region? So it is not a question of economics alone, it's a question of political economy. And it's not only a political economy question inside each country, it's a question of a geopolitical economy. So trying to understand the domestic powers that control the direction of these conflicts and have interests in the continuation of the conflict, while at the same time we know that in most of these troubles, these are proxy wars among regional and global powers, and therefore what are the vested interests of these regional and global powers, and how could they be turned into a cooperative equilibrium that we talked about? How can we make the rebuilding of those countries and a space for convergence among regional and global powers rather than the front line of their confrontation, and reflect that in domestic politics and economics? Addressing the root causes of conflicts is extremely important, and that's why I think we have to redefine the word reconstruction, because we actually one of the reasons I hate my title as Senior Advisor for Reconstruction is the fact that we don't want to rebuild what was there in 2010. We want to rebuild a new social contract. We want to rebuild a social contract that's inclusive and participatory and representative. Now, these are nice words, but realities on the ground in those countries don't bode well for this perfect solution that we are talking about. The inclusive, open, transparent, accountable political economy where the interests of the majority are represented. Now, how can you combine between those desires and the realities and the military balances that are emerging in those countries? It is by using stabilization and early planning for reconstruction to plant the seeds for the future. Planting the seeds of the future meaning re-empowering the middle class, bringing it back to the country, making sure that people who left do return, because without the return of the populations, there is not going to be a sustainable peace. Making sure that the institutions are accountable to the majority and not to a small elite of cronies that had captured the economies before the conflict. And that capture was one of the main reasons for the explosion in our part of the world. Do we want to give the same people the economic pie of reconstruction? And if we do so, what would that mean for the durability and the sustainability of peace and reconstruction? Those are the questions that we are dealing with at the moment, and we will be hopefully providing some ideas very soon about the political economy of reconstruction in the region.
Thank you so much. Terrific remarks from the Special Advisor for Rejuvenation and Rebuilding at the World Bank.
Thank you very much. I like this title much better.
Shanta, please note. Annika, over a decade or more, you've played a role not just in Sweden, but in broader international circles, getting the development community to think more politically, to think more holistically about these kinds of challenges. Seen from your vantage point, maybe just address anything that Abdullah said or offer any other perspective, but I also want to ask you, is the international community ready for the scale and sophistication of the challenge of what it will take to do serious rejuvenation and reconstruction in the Middle East and the North Africa?
If you'd asked me a few months ago, I would have said that Syria is really the case for early conflict resolution, since it started out as part of the Arab Spring, but also as a national, very problematic situation. It then grew to become a proxy war, and as you were hinting at yourself, a global confrontation. But as we said just before our panel started, maybe there is hope now, and maybe we will see global powers, superpowers, realizing in this conflict on Syria and in other conflicts that they may be overplaying their hands and that they are taking the world into a very, very dangerous situation. On a more bureaucratic level, let me say that I think we are very, very bad at uniting developmental, socioeconomic, and cultural and security aspects. And the fact that I myself worked in the development community for many, many years made me realize how important prosperity, participation, and soft features are for a societal development. And then when I came back to the security community only 2-3 years ago, I realized that still, no matter if we are in the UN or in regional contexts, we're not really able to connect all of this. Thirdly, I'm not very optimistic. We're living through a paradigm shift globally. A few, maybe 5-6 years ago, maybe many of us thought that this economic paradigm shift would take some time and move on slowly, and then we will find ourselves in a new situation. Now we see how power rivalry is taking its toll in the MENA region in various variations. The group of stability that GCC, for example, used to be, is now again somewhat challenged. We've not at all succeeded in finding regional structures for security and cooperation for the MENA region in the wider sense. And we can now also see overspill from the Gulf region with the war in Yemen, over the Red Sea into the Horn of Africa. And I would really urge everyone to take a very close look at models and options for regional security arrangements involving Iran, involving Saudi Arabia, involving all the Gulf countries and North Africa, because otherwise there will be no way forward. And I'm sure that civil society, women's organizations, business would all be ready to stand up and support such a process. Finally, let me say that as a European and as a Nordic and a Swede, I would be happy to share our experience, what it means to create stability and prosperity over the years. But also I would really want to refrain from any top-down or intervention in what needs to be homegrown and deal with the root causes in the region itself, no matter how involved it is in global affairs and how it is also affected by this paradigm shift that I'm talking about.
Terrific. I want to bring in the others, but I'm going to come back to you afterwards because you said something very intriguing and I want to pull you out. I realize there may be things you can't say sitting on your perch in the council, but you offered a little bit of hope about the great power and regional power dynamics, and I might see if I can't bring out one more sentence from you on that. We don't get a lot of messages of hope on these topics, so that'd be encouraging to hear. Adama, let me turn to you. You have worked on issues of conflict and war crimes and human rights in a range of regions, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the issues confronting us in this region today.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. First of all, let me say that although I represent the Secretary General, what I'm saying here is that is only my opinions, so to avoid any misunderstanding. I mean, there is no doubt that the region is on fire. And if you go to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, I mean, what we are seeing today is really unacceptable. I mean, the brutality of this war. I was speaking the other day about Raqqa. I mean, can you believe you have civilian population trapped between one side, the coalition forces, the other side, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces. These people, they have no way. Either they try to escape and they are being killed by ISIL. So what is wrong with the Arab world? And can you believe the Arab world, we are talking about 5% of the world population. And today you have almost half of the refugee population coming from the Arab world. So I think we should definitely say what is wrong. And he was referring about the root causes and how to deal with them. I mean, if you take the breakdown of the regional order following the Arab Spring, it was the result of the pressure built from inside. I mean, we owe to Mohamed Bouaziz, the young Tunisian, who finally, really thanks to him, I mean, he died, but thanks to him, something started. And what we witnessed in Tunisia was great. I mean, the whole changes. Just recently, the decision taken regarding the woman to be able to marry the man of their choice, be a Jew, a Christian, whatever. Isn't that another revolution? But unless we take bold decision to see how we can support the current Tunisian government facing so much difficulties, I'm afraid we may see another type of situation, and that is not something we would like to see. And you will see also that the civil wars in the region have been marked by serious violations of human rights, humanitarian law, and in some cases even we witness crimes against humanity, war crimes. And in the case of the Yazidis, for instance, in Iraq, we can even speak about genocide. I mean, I was in Erbil, Dohuk, Baghdad, and I met with all the minority leaders. You know, a place where you can say even it's the cradle of civilization. You have so much diversity, and at the end of the day, you had regimes starting from Saddam Hussein, his successor, Prime Minister Maliki, who didn't care about inclusive governance. So when you have people from within your country who are excluded, don't be surprised that one day, sooner or later, that they stand up and ask for their rights. And that's why I was saying in the coming days there will be a resolution being debated at the Security Council regarding accountability against Daesh. But I say, make sure that also you address the crimes committed by Iraqi security forces, because justice should be done and perceived being done for all minorities, all groups. But if you left the crimes committed, for instance, against the Sunni, they will feel that they are again being excluded. And then I think what we need also to bear in mind when we talk about this, how to stabilize. I mean, the state in the region and also those in the West supporting them, including the United States, I think they must set aside national and strategic interests and cooperate to bring the ongoing civil war to an end. I think we have to make it very clear those states should refrain from encouraging and participating in proxy wars, as he just said earlier. And I think it is also time to overcome sectarian divide in the region. I mean, it is time to bring to an end this Shia-Sunni. We know that the Shia-Sunni divide dated 14 centuries ago, but what we are witnessing in recent decades is simply unacceptable. That means you have two countries, one side Iran, the other side Saudi Arabia, who could play a great role by bringing an end to this tension. But what we are seeing also is, even today, another tension, even within the Sunni faith group. So that also, we need to address it. But most importantly, I think it is important that the governments of the region tackle the real issue of meeting citizens' expectation. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why in November 2015, I convened a meeting in Amman, bringing religious leaders, group faith organizations from the MENA region to discuss about their role in preventing incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. And I can tell you that was not an easy meeting. But at the end, they came really with very concrete recommendations, and particularly placing emphasis on the role of the youth. And I was very pleased that July this year, Secretary General Guterres presided over the launch of the plan of action on religious leaders to prevent incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. And I think that is something very important, because what we are witnessing today, I think that was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Qatar, he made a reference to it, as well as Nasser. We need to get another narrative, but that can be done only if the Arab leaders commit to be really respectful of human rights, respecting the principles of the rule of law, having independent judicial system, having courageous parliament, where the MPs will not be here only to approve whatever would please the president or the king. I think they have to understand that the world has changed, and the youth in the Arab world will not accept what their ancestors accepted. I mean, what they want is a real change in the way of governing. And therefore, you need to prevent all this conflict, to develop a new, I would say, a new way of involving all the people. And I will end with one simple aspect, which I refer always, and my predecessor, Francis Deng, and I wish today he influenced his fellow countrymen in South Sudan. That is what he used to call, following the Brookings, when he was with Brookings, the constructive management of diversity. It is time for the Arab world, the Arab leaders, to understand that no one should be excluded. I thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I thought a very powerful call for responsibility from leaders in the region, as well as other actors, and the powers external, and both regional and global as well. Samar, how do you see these issues? And I'd be particularly interested in this issue that has now come up from all the other speakers about the youth in the region, but speak on any issue that you want at this stage.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Firstly, I would like to say that I'm also here representing myself. I'm in my personal capacities, and I used to be the former vice president of the Arab Foundations Forum, and not the Arab Human Rights Fund.
Okay.
Only the executive director there. I think that the Arab Spring itself and all its post-developments should be an eye-opener, not only to governments, but also to civil society actors and the human rights community itself. I think that we as human rights professionals should look inward and assess the work that has been done and what should be done differently. Stabilization, I think it's everyone's responsibility. I'm saying this because I think that we should all adapt an inclusive and a holistic approach when we talk about stabilization. A few examples that would, in my humble opinion, lead us to long-term results is, for instance, to adhere the new constitutions to human rights standards, to make these constitutions responsive to the population's aspirations and needs. Another example is to enable a safe environment for the work of the civil society. And we all know all the restrictive laws towards NGOs' work, especially in our Arab region and worldwide. So, having said that, we should bear in mind as well that the burgeoning civil society and all these nascent actors who can be also from outside the human rights community, they want to do human rights work, but they may lack the capacities. So here is as well the regional and the international community to build on this momentum and build on the capacities of these nascent actors to do better their work. To answer your question, Bruce, about youth, I think that quality education for all and job creation are the answers. But when we talk about job creations, I came across a study made recently which states that by 2020, we should have created 80 million jobs in the Arab region. I'm not sure where we are today from this goal. Maybe it's an ambitious goal, but this tells us that it's everyone's responsibility. So I think the governments themselves and by themselves, they cannot do this. And we need as well the corporate sector to be more engaged in that sense. But the governments can play a vital role in facilitating this process, maybe by creating a more inclusive context and a more flexible regulatory framework, which can facilitate these startups and create more jobs for youth in the region. Last but not least, I think that the SDGs can be a great tool, actually, with the 2030 agenda. It can be an umbrella, it can be a framework, and we can talk maybe later about how, we can use these SDGs in providing maybe sustainable communities and cities, in providing, more jobs for youth, etc.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And I'm going to come back to you about the SDGs. Annika, you offered this glimmer of hope that maybe someplace in the geopolitics of the region and the powers, there might be some opportunity. So I want to ask both you and Abdullah the same question. Do you see any, or where do you see any movements of leaders in the region, and you don't have to be specific, but leaders in the region or actors in the region or outside the region who are beginning to see the costs of these ongoing wars are outweighing the strategic benefits? Is there some prospect of that change in the cost-benefit calculation, if I could put it that way?
As I said initially, I have a vague feeling that superpowers are realizing that they may take us into situations that we all want to avoid, and I believe that the instability in Northeast Asia is another example where we need to, or they need, and we need to find a solution. Then Abdullah is much more knowledgeable than I am on Syria specifically, but I have the feeling that both global powers and the regional powers are trying to find a solution, and it might be the case that the new zones created could, and I think Abdullah alluded to that as well, could become some sort of building blocks where local authorities and civil society could actually be the partners for maybe not reconstruction but recovery. And if that is the case, maybe that could also lead to more of a political will and interest in actually finding a solution and stopping the proxy activities. Of course, there are many conditions that need to be fulfilled. Also that all armed groups need to find their way out of the country, and that those that encourage activities of various kinds at all levels need to stop encouraging that. And as Abdullah said, we may not be able to, or we may not want to rebuild Syria, but we may need to find not only stability, but also good governance, rule of law, participation, and so forth, because if that cannot happen in Syria, we will not be able to move forward. But let me also mention, as Adama did, Tunisia, because Tunisia is a fantastic example. We reopened our embassy in Tunis after a few years of the Arab Spring, and we really feel that we need to work closely with Tunisia to support their progressive approach, even if it's a bumpy road. And let me remind you that women's participation in Tunisia started already in the 60s. And since I'm on that topic, research shows that peace agreements where women are involved, that important part of inclusivity, those peace agreements are 25% more likely to be sustainable. So the role of women in this cannot be underestimated. On the Security Council, we have so many stabilization issues. We destabilization situations, and we may come back to that, but this is more or less what I wanted to say about Syria, where we're also trying to support the role of women.
Abdullah, you have an extremely rich network of both political and economic colleagues and friends across the region. How do you assess the prospects of a change in the approach?
In an ironic way, there are in the last few years, some very interesting developments have happened that would ensure we are not going back to 2010, and that the seeds of a new society will be emerging. First of all, governments no longer have the financial resources that where they could say, as they used to say in the past, we don't need the private sector, we don't need the civil society, we can fund this. This is over. In a sense, the governments, if they want some sort of stability and tranquility, they will need the private sector and they will need the civil society. Now, of course, we are in realpolitik, and power politics stipulate that they will try to assign those functions to private sector and civil societies close to the governments, that's for sure. But the ability of national institutions to be covering all of the geographical and demographic spaces of any country today has been weakened extremely, and that requires the emergence of local powers and local civil societies and local private sectors with local representation of some sort, and most importantly, local legitimacies that will emerge in order to provide those services. Now, would the new governments or the existing governments support that trend or not? It doesn't really matter. They may resist it for a while, but I can assure you that from 6 to 12 months after the end of the conflict, or at least the military phase of the conflict, all governments in conflict countries will find it central and essential to change the way they deal with their citizens, because the genie is out of the bottle. There is no way you can bring back people to live the way they used to live in 2010. That's finished. When that's in itself is an empowering development, something positive that may come out of these disastrous situations. Now, that also brings me back to Her Excellency's point. I'm not sure the international community is ready to act in accordance with these new realities and act in coordination to benefit from those two new realities and strengthen them and empower them and plant the seeds of the new normal, as we call it, in this part of the world. That I am concerned, frankly, about our ability to do so. There is, at least I can tell you, within the bank, There is an extensive debate about how do we look at new tools and new instruments. We just had a discussion with the IMF yesterday on this matter. What type of tools and instruments could be ready for a reconstruction framework, which is very different from your business as usual programs of the bank and the fund in any country. So if we need an international community that is well prepared, well coordinated, has an in-depth understanding of those new trends in Arab society and can benefit from them, but at the same time, not appearing to be imposing a top-down approach, like Her Excellency says, and here is, again, a foreign-imposed agenda on those countries. How do we balance in an intelligent way those developments will be the key to success, to sustainability of reconstruction in the future, or the failure and relapse to conflict in the near future?
Annika, do you want to comment?
I feel there are so many still destabilizing factors, including that we see more and more authoritarianism spreading, and that this optimistic approach that we will not see authoritarian leadership anymore because leaders realize that people would require participation. I'm not sure, because the developments are sort of going in the other direction in many parts of Africa, in Europe, and elsewhere. So the question is also, how can we convince leaders that this is actually the way forward and that this will lead to prosperity for their countries? Or do they really care about prosperity and the future of their countries? And so I don't want to sound gloomy, but
you were much more optimistic before, and you're
but the overall picture when it comes to participation is very mixed, and we need also to support countries that have still the possibility not to enter into wars, but actually find the way forward. Like Somalia, I'm looking at the foreign minister of Somalia that is actually on the right track, and see to it that conflicts do not spread in such a way that we put a country that is on a good track back into despair.
No.
Yeah, I think I agree. There is no disagreement here. Yes, the tendency of some of the leaders would be to retrench and actually go to not only pre-2010, but even pre-1980 management of their societies. That's why I said in the next 6 to 12 months, those same leaders will find out that it will not work. And that may be where the hope is. But again, the question, are we ready as an international community to put together a joint approach to taking advantage of that critical moment?
Dama, do you think the international community is ready to help if we see these pockets of openness, if we see this shift in the mood? And you've got a lot of experience in dealing with both constructive leaders but also recalcitrant leaders, and I just like your reflections on that.
Well, I would simply say that the international community has, of course, a responsibility, but the primary responsibility lies with the state. I mean, those who are leading today the Arab world, the primary responsibility is in their hands. And that's where I think it is important, as Secretary General Guterres decided, for instance, to promote the youth, to promote the women's participation as well. But he can have those ideas. He just appointed the youngest USG from Sri Lanka, and he just put in place a roster of women mediators. But that need to be translated on the ground by the Arab leaders themselves. And take Syria, for instance. I mean, my good friend, Ms. Tura, the special envoy, is optimistic that things may move. I mean, I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that be the case. But what would happen next? I mean, at the beginning, when Kofi Annan, for instance, made his plan, it was not supported because the Western world found at that time this was not acceptable, Assad to be maintained for 2 years until the next election. Brahimi came. And today, what the Western world refused, they are going to have something which is less. But that's I was at the time bringing members of the civil society of Syria. I took them to Egypt, to Lebanon, thinking what we need to do the day one after the war ceases. Because bringing to an end the war is one thing, but how can we make sure that the people will get together, live together peacefully? How can we make sure that the Alawite tomorrow will not be targeted by the other communities? So that's something very important. We need to think about reconciliation. You cannot simply think in terms of investment, development, but bring the people together, because the healing process, and then also the need for transitional justice, because that is also an important dimension we have to bear in mind. Make sure that at the end of the day, dealing with those atrocities which have been committed, not only for the past, but it will serve also as a deterrent for the future. And then find a way. But sometimes say, oh no, we have our traditional justice system. Okay, but at least make sure that people feel that justice has been done.
Samar, you talked about the sustainable development goals. We've been talking about human rights. We've talked about justice. We've been talking about youth. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the SDGs is, quite apart from their exceedingly ambitious targets, it is a concept of development in which justice and human rights and inclusion is at the core of the concept. It's not an economic concept of development. It's essentially a political concept of development. And I'd just like you to elaborate a little bit on your point that there could be a framework for rejuvenation and rebuilding in the region.
Sure. I would like to add to the transitional justice, which is key element actually in any stabilization. Some people argue the timing, like when can we start, doing transitional justice, while like there is still a lot of conflict, etc. I think regardless of the timing, we should start to pave the way, until the context maybe is more ready for this process to start. As for the SDGs, actually, yes, they are, optimistic. They have optimistic goals, but I am myself, optimistic about them because they are first inequality focused. They are explicitly anchored, in human rights standards. And this gives, a lot of hope to go to the hope again. Most importantly, I think that they encourage all the actors to adopt a participatory and inclusive process. And last but not least, they do strengthen accountability of all actors. And this is very important. So when we talk about civil society and the capacity building and enabling them to do they work in a good way, this doesn't mean that they should not be themselves held accountable. And it is the state's role to hold these actors accountable, but in a proper manner, not through restrictive banking procedures or restrictive NGOs laws. And I do have a few examples that I can share about the SDGs and how we can engage in the SDGs realization. For instance, we can use the SDGs commitments to counter the increasing restrictions on civil society space in many countries. Another example is to translate the SDGs focus on leaving no one behind into practical action. And this includes, fighting against inequalities and discrimination of all kinds, make sure that we have inclusive participation in monitoring and implementing and advocating around the SDGs.
Terrific. I'm going to turn to the audience. I mean, it seems to me that we have identified, first of all, the enormous scale of the challenge, both in numbers and in the realities that confront us. I think we've also touched on the extremely difficult regional and geopolitical dynamics that encase this issue, with some potential signs of beginnings of a shift, but also some very difficult dynamics that will continue to confront us. But we also begin to talk about the elements of a vision of what this would look like in terms of the different kinds of roles of the private sector, of civil society, of human rights, of women, of youth, a very, very different kind of inclusive politics, which ultimately we'd have to get to. That may take a long time, but in my experience in these situations, having some sense of vision of what the elements are like, what kind of society you're heading towards, is an essential part of making sure that whatever is done in the kind of reconstruction phase even, or rejuvenation phase, helps lay the seeds for that work. So let's turn to the audience. We have a huge amount of experience and knowledge in the room, both about the region and the issues, and we'll just open it up, and we'll start over there and come this way. Please identify yourself.
Sure. Hi, good morning. My name is Ali Malik. I'm the author of The Home That Was Our Country, a memoir of Syria. So this question is for Mr. Dariri mostly. You identified two things that I'd like you to clarify. First, that there's no going back to 2010 and putting the genie back in the bottle. But that also means, when we say we're not going back to 2010, are the people that you keep alluding to, the civil sector, civil society and private sector folks who should be assuming these roles. Before 2010, many of them were in Syria, but right now, many of them, thousands of them, have been disappeared, killed, or are in exile. So who exactly are going to fill those roles when you talk about going back to 2010, when you didn't really touch on that? And then second, you're very correct to identify the capture of profits that regime cronies will be able to, that we want to prevent that in the phase of reconstruction. Yet, already right now, while we're in the phase of crisis and humanitarian organizations that sort of hover at these moments, the regime is capturing the profits from that business inside Syria. So all indications are that they will, in fact, capture those profits from reconstruction. So I appreciate your rhetorical comments, but practically, how is the international community really going to be able to prevent that, blunt that, and mitigate that, especially when you identify it as crucial step in the reconstruction of the new Syria?
We'll take a couple of questions and then come back to the panel. There's a gentleman beside you.
Thank you. My name is James Wuye. I come from Nigeria. I just want to further speak on what, or contribute to what Deng has just said about breaking the cycle of violence. The people within this region, under our view or our reflections, are people who have suffered tremendous emotional, psychological, humiliating experiences. And from the statistic given by Bruce is that a couple of people are quite in millions and trillions. We're talking about economy and all that. Now, to really start to break the cycle of violence is to begin to forgive. And I think forgiveness will break the cycle of violence. Justice is there, but there should be forgiveness before reconciliation. Everybody in that region, so many people are hurt by these issues of conflict that has emanated from there. And I see the role of religious leaders who are inclusive in their theology coming to bear in terms of bringing people back, in collaboration, of course, with regional governments. So I see a role of religious leaders prominently in that region, and if they can be engaged, I think we will start what we call divine subtle intimidation strategy to bring back people through divinity to the senses of looking at the SDGs in terms of breaking the cycle before going further. So I support what Deng has said, and I think it must be practically done and not just in the rhetorics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here. I'm going to take this as last question from this round, and then we'll come back to the panel, and then we'll do another round before we break.
صباح الخير. أحمد العكايلي يرجى أن نتحدث بالعربية. أحكي؟ Can't talk?
Do we have? I don't think we have translation. Do we have?
إنجليزي وريحنا الله يرضى عليك.
He can help us. Go ahead.
أوكي. أحمد العكايلي من الأردن. كشاب عربي أريد أن أقدم وجهة نظري باتجاه الانفجار أزمات العرب في هذه الفترة الراهنة. أنا أعتقد أن الأزمة هي أزمة النظام العربي الرسمي الذي بني ما بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية على فكرة تركز السلطة لخدمة النظام الدولي ثنائي القطبية القائم على توازن القوى أو يعني تركز القوى بيد المنظومة الدولية. هذه الأنظمة كانت مركزية في الاقتصاد وريعية اقتصاديا بحيث أنها تضمن ولاء الشعوب والناس لها دون القدرة على أي حراك سياسي في المجتمع العربي. إلى عام 2008 انفجرت أزمة النظام أو عام 2010-2011 انفجرت أزمة النظام العربي الرسمي مع تغير المنظومة الدولية السياسية، بمعنى أنني أريد أن أقول أن الأزمة بأساسها سياسية، وأن العامل الاقتصادي كان في خدمة السياسي، ونتيجة تغير المنظومة الدولية الأزمة. أعتقد أن الحل سوف يكون بإعادة توزيع أوراق القوى السياسية على المجتمع، ولكن ليس وفق قاعدة ديمقراطية الجماعات الأهلية التي تم تطبيقها في العراق ويراد تطبيقها اليوم على سبيل المثال في سوريا. عندما نقيم لا مركزية اقتصادية مبنية على رؤية سياسية مجتمع واحد، فإننا لن نتساءل ماذا سيحل بالعلويين ما بعد انتهاء الأزمة. أعتقد أن الأساس الذي يجب أن تدفع به المنظومة الدولية هو فتح البوابة لتسويات بين أبناء الشعب الواحد، ثم تسويات إقليمية لحل أزمات الشرق الأوسط، وعلى رأسها أزمة القضية الفلسطينية أو مأزق إسرائيل وإشكالية احتلالها للأراضي العربية. شكرا.
Okay, so let's come back to the panel and we'll, in the order that we started. So Abdullah, feel free to address anything that you heard and feel free to ignore anything that you heard. So I'm just teasing. No, try to address anything you heard.
Yes, sure. My comments were about the region in general, and these are what I believe as preconditions for successful reconstruction. Now, if I may take off my World Bank hat for a couple of minutes and try to address your comments. In 2010, as you may know, well, the country at that time was overperforming on all of the MDGs indicators. That I just wanted to address the question of the SDGs, and we need to be careful about what do we mean by SDGs and what are we reading in them. Syria in 2010 was the only Arab country that outperformed in all the 8 MDGs. So what does that mean? So, what I'm trying to say is that during those past 6 years, very interesting, capable, and representative civil society movements have been rising in the country. And I think regardless of where you stand politically, you cannot ignore those new forces. My other point about the cronies applied to every reconstruction program, and you are right, yes, we can see clearly, and this is power politics, this is what I wanted to say, is that a party that thinks it's winning any conflict would try to allocate the resources, the economic resources at hand to the closest economic powers to them. However, in my personal opinion, the extent of the damage, social and economic, in Syria goes beyond the capacity of any single party to the conflict to rebuild it and fix it. That requires all of Syrians, inside and outside. That's why I insisted on the question of people returning, inside and outside, taking part in the reconstruction process. And that would, even with that reconstruction would be extremely difficult, almost unattainable, by the way, due to the extent of damage in the country. Therefore, when I said in the 6 to 12 months to come, reality will hit. The fact that a small number of close business people will not be enough to rebuild a country so damaged like Syria or other countries in the region. So yes, the power politics would lead us to conclude that the cronies will be the ones taking care of reconstruction, but also power politics in the wider sense, in the wider sense of the real damage and the need for reconciliation and the need for new legitimacy, by the way. It's not enough to have your troops on the ground somewhere. You need to rebuild a legitimacy of somewhere, and that can only come with peace dividends, with showing that you are inclusive, and that you are willing to bring everyone on board. So let's wait and see. And my proposition here is that for the international community to be ready for that moment, to lend a supporting hand, not to any reconstruction, but to a reconstruction that could actually plant the seeds for more inclusive societies, more representative societies. I hope I addressed your points.
One of the things that Brookings is doing, and the working group tomorrow, this afternoon tomorrow, will pick this up, is a very important project we have together with the World Bank to look at this exact issue. What have been the patterns in the past of how international actors and regional actors have intervened in these cases, I mean, intervened economically and politically, and what are the lessons, both in terms of what we should do, but very importantly, what we shouldn't do in terms of that kind of engagement that Abdullah is talking about, and working with the wider community, listening to voices in the region, and making sure that those lessons are heard and that the international community is ready if and as those opportunities arise. Annika.
Thank you. The question is, of course, always the sequencing. When are we ready to do recovery? When are we ready to do reconstruction? Would we, if we came forward with very strong reconstruction programs, play into the situation so that reconciliation would not take place? Impunity will be more difficult. Will we have to pay a price on the impunity issue, as in many, many conflicts? I'm thinking of the Colombia peace agreement that is very complex, 40 pages long. Everyone took part, and it seems to be moving forward after 50 years. And there you have very little involvement from external actors. In this situation, what we're also facing is some kind of approach where interest of the US, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Gulf, Israel, and many others will have to be dealt with in one way or the other. And at the same time, we mustn't forget the people that would be the ones to rebuild the country. I think we were in Sweden somewhat foresighted because we decided on a Syria strategy last year that is open both for development, humanitarian, neighboring countries, and recovery. And of course, we're a small player, even if we are comparatively big when it comes to supporting other countries compared to our size. But I believe we really need to get our heads around what this complexity means for the start of this endeavor, and who would like to pay, and what would that payment imply when it comes to influence. We've not overcome the regional rivalry, if I put it that way.
In this project that I mentioned with the World Bank, we had a meeting in Amman supported by JICA, and we had actors there from Iraq, from Syria, from Jordan, Tunisia, Libya, etc. And one of the key messages that came from that is, even though we look at the enormous scale of the reconstruction that's going to be necessary, one of the key messages was go small and go slow. Don't rush in with big money, which is only going to reconstruct the old politics and the old dynamics, but go slow and be small and be careful and sort of build that new system. I thought that was a very important message to hear. So, Adama, anything you want to add?
Well, and put also systems which will prevent corruption. Yeah. Because in the process of rebuilding, there will be also a risk of embezzlement of the funds. And I think that is something you have to make sure, and as I agree with you, it's a process. I was telling her before the meeting that it took almost 25 years to rebuild Lebanon, yes. And in the Syria case, I think it might take half a century. But one has to be simply determined and make sure that the people, at the end of the day, change completely their way of perceiving governance. I mean, I can tell you, the young Syrian I met with, I mean, from all groups, you know, totally dedicated. I mean, these people tomorrow, when they will return to Syria, they will have no hatred against the others. But it will require also that we strengthen education. And including among those who are in charge, education, the religious leaders. You know, they are dealing with a new generation. And that's where I am very much concerned when I see some of the Salafists, be they in Saudi Arabia, be they in Qatar. There is a need for those people to realize that the world has changed. And that Islam, and here I return again to the issue of Islam. Islam is a religion of freedom, and that's why I was very pleased the other day when Bahrain signed that declaration on the freedom of choice about religion. You know, it's a first step. It's not perfect, but I think this is the first step. Let's invest more also educating the youth. I mean, and that's why I was very pleased when I saw the Finnish network of religious and traditional peacemakers involved in this type of operation when I contributed to the adoption of the Marrakesh Declaration, which was very important, revisiting the constitution of Madinat al-Munawwar. It was the first constitution which recognized it and granted the rights of religious minorities. You know, and I always said, I mean, come on, you cannot say those people, you have to change your religion. I mean, the Prophet of Islam, he opened the doors of the Mosque of Medina to bishops who celebrated La Fête des Rameaux. You know, wasn't that the first illustration of an ecumenical dialogue? And why in the 21st century you have these crazy, these mad people speaking about giving another thing of Islam? We have to stand. You know, and that's education would help to really change that perception.
Samar.
I would like to second actually Obama for the anti-corruption system, and I think that all the international community should be, you know, like very serious about this, and not to turn, you know, like a blind eye towards any government just because, you know, like they have some special cases that they need to deal with, or they have, you know, like a refugees crisis, you know, like that they are dealing with. So I think that this should be taken very seriously. And speaking about the nascent actors from the civil society, I actually agree with you, Bruce, about not to, you know, like invest a lot of money and give them actually, or flood them with a lot of money that, you know, surpass their capacities. So we should, you know, like do this incrementally. We should build the capacities of these nascent actors first, and then, you know, like once they are ready, they have all the technical capacities, you know, like to manage a project or, you know, like an amount of money, we can then, you know, like try to pilot some projects, and then, you know, while assessing them, we can see if they can, you know, like be ready for more and more bigger projects in the future.
Great. Let's go back to the audience for one last round. I'm going to look more at this half of the room since I privileged that half of the room. But okay, we'll start in the middle at the back.
Marie Momtaz with ABC News. This is a question about Syria. How do you expect Reconstruction to deal with the forced displacement and dispossession that is being put in place through these surrender or peace or reconciliation agreements, whatever you want to call them? How do you counter that once Reconstruction has to take place?
Okay. Behind you.
Hi, Tawfiq Rahim. Do you think this discussion is, you know, realistic? There's a lot of, you know, I hear the words like civil society. I remember working in Syria before 2011. You weren't allowed to say Mujtama al-Madani. So, I mean, you have the restoration of a dictator who has gotten back stability on the country, where this reconstruction will happen through mass killing. You have, you know, rampant extremism that has spread to many areas. I mean, maybe what we're looking for is not some type of ideal solution, but really a compromise middle ground of imperfect stability, where you have moderate economic restoration, underlying hatred that still will continue, but at least it's not a civil war. Maybe that's a more realistic outcome. I don't want to be a pessimist, but it just seems like we're shooting for something that might not be in the cards. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, gentleman there.
Anas Al-Tikriti, CEO of the Cordoba Foundation in London. Again, like the gentleman, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I think it's necessary to try not to appear as though we're having a discussion that is absolutely detached from the reality on the ground. When we talk about stabilization in the MENA region, I would like to ask stabilization for whose benefit? Because we have carried out numerous surveys of trends amongst the youth in various Arab countries. And I don't know whether you'd like to believe it or not, but the last thing on these people's mind is stability. And the first thing on their mind is change. And I fear that sometimes when we're talking about stability, we're talking about stability for the benefit of those who don't really have to live through the horrors of being amongst the tens of millions of young Arabs who dream of nothing more than to leave that area for the West. So I'd like to take a step back maybe and address the concept itself of when we're talking about stability, for whose benefit. Thank you.
Good. So I was pulling out from all of you some slivers of optimism that I saw, but the audience is pushing us back into a more realist account of the difficulties. But please, let's start with the Senior Advisor for Revolution at the World Bank, and any final comments that anyone will make, and then we'll break for lunch.
No, I don't think we are detached from reality. If anything, this panel is very much has feet on the ground. What we are suggesting here is that we understand reality very much. We understand the forces that are at play and propose realistic measures for now, but take into consideration the future. You know, without a vision for the future, you can do daily activities for the next 100 years and you will not achieve much. You actually need a vision. What type of societies are we talking about? So in order to be able to break away from that vicious cycle of tyranny, poverty, and ignorance, you have to have a vision for what type of future you want to achieve. However, at the same time, make sure, and I think we all do, make sure that you understand what's happening today. As I said, people will not accept a return to the past because young people want to see either change or want to leave the country. I don't believe personally that you can rebuild any of those countries without the involvement of all its populations. Now, this may sound like a pipe dream at the moment, but that's a reality. Those countries cannot be rebuilt, and those societies cannot achieve any future economic prosperity without reconciliation, and reconciliation cannot happen without the full involvement of all citizens in an inclusive political economy system. Now, this is not thinking, above the clouds. This is very much entrenched in the realities of the region. What we are trying to propose here is, first, let's understand where were the roots of this conflict. And that's what I said. It's not only in economics. It's a question of participation, it's a question of empowerment, it's the sense of marginalization, it's the sense of distancing a large part of the societies from active political participation. All of these issues are at the root causes of these conflicts, and these conflicts cannot be addressed without addressing them. So yes, stabilization, and that's a very good question that you asked. Stabilization for what? It's a stabilization that could prepare the ground for an inclusive political process and an inclusive political economy down the road. A stabilization that services and serves a status quo, probably not the best stabilization. So I think the questions you are raising are extremely important and pertinent, but at the same time, I think it's central to whatever we do, is to have a vision where we want to see these countries and to have a very realistic programs on the way forward. I think we agree on these things. Maybe we are not in a position to detail the atrocities and the pains that people are going through. But trust me, I think this group, this panel, is fully aware and fully conscious, morally and from a knowledge point of view, fully conscious of the needs for reconciliation and rebuilding those societies.
Adama.
Well, I think I agree. A key question, which type of society do they want? And that is not the UN, that is not the World Bank, that's the people who will decide the type of society they want. And it's not, I think when you speak about the root causes, the economics, I think the economics, to me, are simply a result from the other elements. They are the causes, the consequences of the poor governance, the consequences of the lack of respect of the rule of law. I mean, how can you develop a country? How can you make the economic prospering if you don't respect at all those basics? And I think there is also one important dimension we have to realize. I mean, as you said, it's not being optimist, but I do trust that the young people within the Arab world, they are ready to sacrifice, and they have shown, they have demonstrated. And tomorrow, we have to make sure that they be part of the process. I mean, I think the participatory process is key for the tomorrow management in the Arab world. And that's where I am afraid the Western world is not always also helping. And when I say the Western world, it's not only the Western world. You have too many interests. I mean, you have on one hand today, for instance, China, you have India, you have everybody trying to get into this market. And at the end, to the extent of even compromising on principles, you will, instead of putting things very clear, you are ready to invest to make sure that your national market benefit from it, closing your eyes on what is happening on the ground. And I think that's where I said, if you make sure that from now, and that's something we have started at our level, very modest, getting the people to start reflecting. But I'm sure the World Bank has changed a lot, to be honest. I mean, I remember the World Bank in the early 90s when I was promoting corruption. My good friend Ibrahim Shatta, the Vice President Legal Advisor, said, well, Adam, you know, this is a very sensitive, speaking about human rights and the World Bank, etc. And finally, at the Human Rights Commission, the same. When I get a resolution of the subcommission on the fraudulent enrichment of top state officials detrimental to the public interest, the subcommission adopted the resolution. The Human Rights Commission, there, United States, Japan said, well, this is not a human rights issue. This is criminal, should be sent to Vienna, the UNODC. And thanks to Babacar Ndiaye, the president of the African Development Bank, I hold a meeting on the obstacle to the enjoyment of economic and social rights, corruption being the major obstacle. So you see, and that's how we managed to get this African Convention to fight corruption, you know. But nowadays, the World Bank, IMF, they put corruption as something very important key. And that's why I said in this rebuilding process, we need to invest a lot in this area.
Sure.
Actually, I would like to say that I was personally engaged in working to support civil society actors working in and for Syria. So the example that I have been talking about is a real example. So it was, you know, like a real project where civil society actors and even the local councils were supported. They were given special thematic workshops to build on their capacities in human rights and project management and budgets, monitoring and evaluation, all this. So what I want to actually highlight here is that the process is very challenging. It is very difficult, and it requires a lot of flexibility. I can't tell you how many groups I was personally working with directly, they had to stop their projects, or they had several delays because some of their team members have died. Literally, they died. So we need to be optimistic, yet realistic. So when we are talking about supporting human rights groups in Syria, or even people from outside the human rights community to work for the advancement and realization and protection of human rights, we know that it would be very challenging, it would be risky. We should always apply the do no harm policy. We should be very flexible, and this applies. And we need to be as well, like creative, like how you transfer money to the groups who are working there. You need to, like create or invent some unconventional measures to support these groups. So this is the reality. This is actually the sad reality, but this does not mean that we should be like pessimistic or say that people do not want stabilization and they only want change, etc. So stabilization is maybe, I think, a process. It's not, something that will be done over one night. We need to be patient, we need to be creative, we need to be flexible, but we need as well to stay optimistic regardless all the devastating situation that we are dealing with.
Thank you. Annika, final thoughts.
Thank you. I believe we're in a hurry. If the fight against Daesh is successful, no matter how complicated matter is, we may also see new differences appearing among the actors. I fear that the political will surrounding Syria is not strong enough. I believe that we need to work in order to create such a political will, both top-down and from the local societies. And on the issue of how a peace agreement can actually come forward, what I see happening is the Syrian opposition becoming more and more aligned. And I hope that that means that they can be a key player together, and that group will become more inclusive, as many of the already members want it to be. I see that as a very important factor. Secondly, the word stabilization is, of course, a very difficult word, because if it is about keeping status quo, it will not entail all the values and improvements that I believe all of us in this room want to see. So what we want to see is the stop of killings, we want to see peace, and we want to see us paving the way for more prosperity and participation. I hope that what I've said about the destabilizing factors like superpowers not interested, proxy wars, abuse of religion, religious differences, the struggle for natural resources, the climate change issues, that all of those destabilizing factors, that we can deal with them and that we can make them an asset when we discuss how to support recovery, both at the local level and when we work together with also people that return. And we have 150,000 Syrians in Sweden. We have a population of 10 million, and they are already making great contributions to our society, but we're of course willing to work with them in order for them to be able to return. Thank you.
I would just make one reflection. I don't ever in these kinds of settings feel a need to apologize for trying to inject some degree of optimism. There is such unrelenting cynicism and brutality of the political actors that we are confronting, both at the national and the regional and the global level, and they don't need any help from us to drive serious cynicism. And it's, I think, always helpful in forums like this to explore what are the boundaries of a more optimistic future. The challenge, I think, is to be realistic about the time frames that it's going to take to get there. These are not things that are going to be achieved overnight. In my work, I spent a lot of time working on civil wars, and I think people often underestimate how long it takes to go from where we are now to a more hopeful future. As I said at the beginning, these are crises that were forged over generations, and it will take generations to be at the point of the kind of vision we're talking about. But you start from where you are, and I think you move towards an ambitious and an optimistic vision with all due account of the realities that we confront. So my huge thanks to all of you for your contributions, not just to this panel, but in the real world, trying to tackle these issues in real time. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.